Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh the facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and pony owner. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing easy keepers on multiple acres of pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and like all good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We talk about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode.
Buying and developing a young horse is a special equestrian journey. Not only are you caring for that horse in that moment, you're setting it up for life. It's a journey that can be great fun, but it comes with a heavy responsibility. My senior year of high school, I bought a weanling foal from the Dartmoor pony sales. This foal had been born on the moors by my house, and I had watched him from the time he was born in the spring. And we used to hang out a lot, like over the summer. Once I was done with school and I'd finished all my senior year exams, we'd hang out together. I'd go sit on the ground and he'd come investigate me, and we became good friends. And so we got to know each other. And when the sales came around that August, I was determined to buy him and kind of have him as a project. And sure enough, with my help of my granddad, who was a dairy farmer and kind of used to going to livestock auctions, we went together to the auction, and I found myself going home from that auction with a weanling. And it was the beginning of a 4-year journey of trial and error, because at the time I was pretty ignorant about feeding weanlings and growing horses. But thankfully, this foal was very hardy and it put up with all my mistakes.
Well, in our last episode, you made a strong case that foal nutrition really starts with the mare at or before conception. And today we're going to focus on young horse nutrition starting at birth.
Yeah, 100%. Like the foal nutrition definitely starts with the mare, and, either at or before conception. And in those first weeks after foaling, foal nutrition is still with the mare because the foals are not eating solid food right away, right? So that weanling that I purchased, he'd lived in a very kind of like wild situation. They're free roaming on equivalent to like BLM land in the US. And so she was just getting by on whatever she could find. So they were very hardy, and he was very hardy, thankfully. But yeah, definitely in their early life, all foals are really relying just on their mom. In fact, foals are born with no teeth, right? So they have to, they're living on liquids because they have no teeth. And then the incisors start coming in when they're about a week old. And so really those early days, obviously before foaling, you're really focusing on the mare, but even those sort of early days and weeks after the foal is born, you need to be making sure that the mare is well fed and able to produce adequate milk so that she can support the foal, appropriately. And I don't think a lot of people realize just how much a mare's nutrient demands go up in lactation. I think we think a lot about pregnancy and, you're eating for two kind of thing, and you need to eat all these things. And I think in the last episode, we talked a little bit about the fact that really the mare's requirement doesn't go up that much, when she's pregnant. It's sort of the difference between not doing any work and being in light work. It's really not that big of an increase, certainly from a calorie standpoint. But when you look at the mare in early lactation and you could compare it to, if you took that same mare and put her in full race training, the mare in lactation has a greater need for protein than that mare would if she were in full race training, and almost as many calories. She needs almost as many calories during lactation as she would if she were in full race training. And when I share that with people, when I do like in-person events, you can see their faces are just kind of like, whoa. Like, I think we think of racehorses, right? Like super high energy demand, super, intense exercise, need a ton of calories. So to realize that the mare in lactation is almost at that level of calorie requirement is pretty mind-blowing. And then the other nutrient she has a really high demand for is calcium to support bone development in that foal, right? And that calcium needs to be in a balanced ratio with phosphorus. And all of this protein and calcium passes to the foal to support growth. Because really, if you think about everything the foal is developing, whether it's skeleton, muscle, all those tissues, like they all contain a really high level of protein. And then obviously the bones have a really high level of calcium. So that's got to be coming from the mare as well.
Yeah, I think, when you think about the race training compared like that they have to have the same amount of calories. You think of a racehorse being so slim, right? And like a body condition of like 4.5, they're so lean. Right. And then you look at a broodmare who's just had a baby. So, their bellies are pretty big and they look, right. wide. You just don't think
they
that they
very
need
fit.
Right. They don't look very fit. So you just don't think they would need that many calories. Like it is really surprising to know that they would need that much, the same amount of food. It's crazy.
Yeah, I see a lot of underfed lactating brood mares and a lot of overfed pregnant mares. And I think that unfortunately does come from that sort of human, pregnancy thing of like, we just have that joke of like, oh, you're eating for two kind of thing, and, not all women breastfeed or whatever. So there isn't so much knowledge around breastfeeding and the realities of that in sort of human nutrition, I think, in the wider human Western world society. And so they don't have that same connection with that. But if you ask anybody that has breastfed a baby, it's very energy intensive. And you can almost eat anything because the nutrient demands of keeping up with producing milk for your baby are really high. And it's the same for the lactating broodmare as well.
Lots of times you see young foals eating hay. They'll be out in the pasture and they look like they're eating it. I mean, are they actually eating it?
Yeah, I mean, they are. I mean, they are out there picking it and they are eating it. But like I mentioned, they don't really have a lot of teeth, right? So they're not really, they don't chew things really well, and they don't have a developed hindgut microbial population when they're first born. So they're not really able to digest forage. They're certainly not able to digest a super stemmy hay, right? They're going to be better off, if you think about it, they're in the natural setting, they would be born into a very grassy environment, right? And so the grass is soft and easy to chew. So it's much easier for a foal that doesn't have a lot of teeth to process grass than it is a dried, especially a stemmy hay, right? And foals are really curious and they eat all kinds of things. I mean, like they're very into kind of everything. And that includes feces, right? A lot of people see foals eating feces and it kind of freaks them out. But this is just part of them developing their hindgut microbial population, right? There are microbes from, say, the herd of horses that they're living with. And there are microbes in those horses' feces. And then the foals kind of pick at the feces and whatever, whether it's out of curiosity or some innate knowledge that that's what they should do. And then those, bacteria are going to help populate the hindgut. But they're picking up bacteria from all over the place, right? Everything they touch, everything in our environment has microbes on it, right? So by mouthing and touching and processing so much stuff with their mouths, all these bacteria are entering their hindgut. And so they start to develop that hindgut microbial population. But they're deriving very little nutritional value from any forage they're eating in those first few weeks of life.
I assume that if they have a poorly developed microbial population, that this means that any forage that they do eat should be easily digested.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So forage quality is a huge consideration at this point, not only for the foal, but the mare too, in part because her demands are so high. If she has any hope of meeting her needs from predominantly forage, that forage better be good quality, right? So in order to meet these massive increases in protein need and calorie intake, the forages do need to be very good quality and easily digestible. So this is not the time for that stemmy, mature hay that we're always talking about in other episodes, right? Whenever we're talking about, I feel like we spend a lot of time talking about low calorie, not very digestible, stemmy, mature hay, because for a very large number of horses in the population, that is a good hay choice for them, right? The easy keepers, the ones that become obese easily, whatever. That's not the hay for this population of horses, right? These are the horses that really need that leafy green, lower maturity, higher calorie, higher protein type hay. And they just won't be able to digest it adequately enough to get the nutrition they need out of it if it's too stemmy and mature.
If these mares need such a high intake of protein, would it be good to feed them alfalfa since alfalfa is higher in protein and calcium?
Yeah, alfalfa can be a really useful addition to the broodmare diet, especially if she's not on pasture, right? So if you're in a location with like places like where you live in Iowa, where you can have really good quality spring pasture, the pasture should provide enough quality forage. Oh, well, that was a good one. Enough quality forage. So there's a reason why foals are born in the spring, right? If you think about it, it's a beautiful system. Like all these things, when they just develop naturally, tend to just work until we get involved, right? So they're born on spring pasture. Think about a spring pasture, right? That pasture is gaining quality as the spring goes on. However, if you don't have access to pasture or the pastures are not adequate enough to provide all the necessary forage and you're having to feed some hay, then adding some alfalfa can be a great solution because it is much higher in protein. It's got a good amount of calcium in it. So these are the things that can be missing in some of our grass hays. So yeah, absolutely. But like I always say, like I still don't like to feed more than 25-30% of the forage intake as alfalfa because at that point, even for the lactating mares, it's too much protein. And then depending on where you are in the country, some of those calciums can get really quite high in some alfalfas. Like out here in the western states, it's not uncommon for alfalfa to have 7 times, 5, 6, 7 times more calcium than phosphorus. And our overall calcium phosphorus ratio we want in the diet is 1.5 to 2 times more calcium than phosphorus. And if you start feeding a lot of alfalfa, it's really hard to bring that back down to an ideal ratio. And while perhaps I don't worry about it as much for mature horses, I do worry about the calcium phosphorus ratio a lot in young growing horses because obviously it is super important for that developing bone.
Can I go totally off topic for a second?
Of course.
You know what freaks me out the most about foals? Do you want to guess?
Oh, this is going to be good. What freaks you out about foals, Jill?
Their feet. What do they call them when they're first born? Slipper something? What are they called?
Oh, gosh. Yes, the something slippers. If nobody's seen this, you have to go. That is pretty freaky.
They totally, my gosh, I don't even want to talk about it.
How do we get here?
Because I don't have foals. I'm never going to have a foal. We never get to talk about foals. And I think that everybody should know that their little baby feet freak me out. Do they freak you out? They're so weird.
Yeah, they have little, how do we describe it? Like tentacles on the bottom of their feet.
They look like aliens. Like that alien, like in any alien movie, and the mouth opens up and it's got like all those feelers that come out of the mouth. Oh.
It's like, it's kind of like whale. Right. It's like, they're not strings. They're like tentacles. They're tentacles. And they're all over the bottom of the feet. And for people who are like, what are you talking about? Like, they actually protect the mare's uterus, right, from being damaged by the feet. The foal's feet are very soft when they're born, and they have all these squishy tentacles on the bottom, but they lose them really quickly. Right, they're gone really quickly. But if you didn't know that they had those, can you imagine being at a foaling and seeing that? You'd be like, oh my gosh, it's deformed. What is going on?
Every time I see them on Facebook, I scroll past as fast as I can. They just freak me out. Anyway, that's it. We'll keep going. Sorry, I just had to say it because we're never going to talk about foals again. When do you start feeding foals? When's the foal actually going to start getting regular food?
When do we actually step in and start feeding the foal as opposed to just relying on the mom?
Right.
Well, mare's milk production drops at around 4 months, right? So naturally. And so to maintain a steady growth rate, it's often advisable to introduce a well-formulated growth feed around that time. Right? And so some mares will have been receiving concentrate feeds in addition to forage prior to this. Let me just plug our favorite feed, the ration balancer again. There are definitely some mares that even in lactation can, be fine with abundant, really good quality forage or maybe really good quality pasture, but they're still going to need that ration balancer to fill those, micronutrient gaps, right? But certainly mares who've had multiple foals back to back or some of the harder keeping tight mares, they're probably going to need some additional support beyond the forage because it may be hard for them to get enough nutrition out of that forage to meet their needs, right? So some of these mares probably have been receiving concentrate feed, since the foal was born, maybe even a little bit before when the foal was born. I would cover that in the last episode, right? My preference is to put a little bit of that feed in there before the foal is born. And so sometimes the foals are stealing that from mom, right? Like if you put a pan of feed or bucket of feed on the ground, the foal will invariably come over because they're curious and they're watching mom, and mom's eating this, so maybe I should try it too. And they'll steal some of that too. That's not ideal. I've actually seen some foals that have very passive mothers, especially first-time mothers, who those mares like that don't stand their ground. And then, we had a foal in a barn that I was in some years ago now. That foal would just stick its head in the bucket, and the mare would be like, okay. The mare was getting a large amount of grain to try and support her lactation and condition, and that foal was just consuming considerable amounts of feed that really he should not have been consuming. So it's really not ideal for them to steal the mare's feed, although sometimes I appreciate you can't get around it. And if they are going to steal the mare's feed, then it's really important that the mare is eating a well-balanced, properly fortified commercial feed, not only for the mare, but also for the foal that's, stealing it from her. So to back up and answer your question specifically, you're probably going to be like starting to introduce foals specifically to that foal around about 4 months.
So a lot of the growth feeds seem to have a really large feeding rate, like somewhere along the lines of like 1 pound per month of age, which I think is funny because if you had a mini or like a Shetland pony, right. Can you imagine if it was 4 months old and you're giving it 4 pounds of growth? Like that seems outrageous. So we always say follow the feeding instructions. In this situation, are we still following the feeding instructions on the bag?
Well, yeah, hopefully those feeding instructions clarify the weight oftentimes they'll give you the mature weight of that foal, right? Not the weight the foal is in that moment, the weight the foal will be when it's mature. So you have to have some idea of how heavy dad is and how heavy mom is and how big you think the foal's going to end up. Or they'll, clarify so that hopefully there is some clarifier in there. So you're not feeding the mini foal the same amount as you're feeding the warm blood foal, right? That's a really good point. But let's just say we're feeding an average, warm blood thoroughbred quarter horse type foal. It is, again, a lot of these directions a lot of the research in growing horses has been done in race horses, right? And quarter horses, because that's sort of where the research funding comes from. And so obviously they're very different from, say, a Connemara pony, right? Very different metabolism. So yes, there are some foals I would feed that way, and there are going to be others that I don't. So again, I've had foals that honestly have just gotten some ration balancer, mom's milk, and picked at the hay, and they've turned out just fine. Those, again, generally the easy keeping type breeds. I've had a bunch I used to work with a Andalusian PRE breeder, and that was sort of what we did for hers. And then there are others that, the foal is definitely going to be getting that, 1 pound per month of age type intake per day. But again, it's important, if the foal is 4 months old, and so you're looking at approximately, if you're following the feeding directions, would be about 4 pound intake per day, that you're not feeding that in one go, right? Because this foal is still quite small.
Tiny.
Yeah, still quite tiny. That would be way too much feed in one meal.
So growing too quickly gets linked to developmental orthopedic issues, and I would think feeding that much grain would increase that risk. Is that true?
There is data out there suggesting that if you're feeding sort of higher starch intakes, that may contribute to, developmental conditions. So, keeping that in mind is important. But there's lots of things that lead to, what we often call as OCD, which stands for, oh my gosh, let's see if I can pronounce this, osteochondritis dissecans. It's the end of the week. I'm impressed I can wrap my tongue around that, right? So that's what OCD is. And it's a OCD is a joint condition that we see in some young horses, and typically it's resulting from abnormal cartilage development, and it's a form of osteochondrosis, right? And so it occurs when the blood supply, so that cartilage is growing, right? And it needs blood supply to take nutrients to the cartilage to help it grow. So it has the nutrients it needs to grow. And if that blood supply gets disrupted, then you're at risk of developing these, joint conditions. So, and in some cases, the cartilage will heal on its own. And in fact, at the recent Kentucky Equine Nutrition Conference, Dr. Pagan shared some, really interesting research looking at thoroughbred foals, and they do. The thoroughbred industry generally will do radiographs on all the horses before they go to the sales, because all of that has to be disclosed, right? Nobody's going to buy a potential Kentucky Derby winner as a yearling unless they've got, x-rays on it to make sure that it's, joints look good. So they have all these radiographs done, these spring radiographs done, and they're all reviewed by, a radiologist. And it's tricky because the radiologist has to decide in that moment, if there are abnormalities there, is this the kind of abnormality that requires surgery? Or is this the kind of abnormality that in 6 months' time is going to have gone away on its own? I don't know that I would want the responsibility of that decision, frankly.
That's a tough job.
Right? The kind of money that gets exchanged for these horses. So, in some cases, as I said, the cartilage will heal on its own. In others, it's going to deteriorate and can result in fragments. And so you'll hear people talk about OCD chips. The horse has got an OCD chip in its hock and its stifle. Like, those are very common chip locations. And then, of course, the problem with that is that if those chips then detach from the surface of the bone, they can cause inflammation and then obviously joint pain. And it's just such a tricky thing, right? All these things, because again, it's always just because you see something doesn't mean to say it's going to become something. And anyway, it's tricky. And if you don't treat some of these and take the chips out, then you might end up with, developing arthritis at a younger age. So it's tricky. So yes, nutrition does play a component in this, but there are a lot of other factors too. And again, some of these were covered at that conference, at the Kentucky Equine Research Nutrition Conference. Things like birth weight and how heavy the foals are at certain points in time of its life, that can play into OCD. Genetics plays into it. Lifestyle plays into it. So everyone always points to nutrition, but it's not always nutrition, right? So we've still got a lot to learn about it. One thing we do know is that trying to maintain a steady growth rate is important, and not have your foal growing like really quickly 1 month and then it slows down the next and then it goes back to being quick again. That yo-yoing seems to be, a component of it. Dr. Don Capper, who sadly passed away, who I sort of considered a mentor and did a lot of work in foal nutrition during his career, especially in orphan foals, really fascinating stuff. And he personally bred warm blood, so he really kind of got sort of the sport horse breeding side of things. I mean, he once said to me that, you can't feed a foal beyond its genetic ability. And, I spent some time pondering that. And, what he was meaning was you can't make a foal grow faster than its genetic potential, right? So you're either meeting that foal's genetic potential or you're not meeting the foal's genetic potential. And I thought it was a really interesting thing to think about, like when you think about it. You can't, like, we all have a genetic, it kind of goes back to what we talked about in the last episode, right? We all have a genetic predisposition of how fast we could grow, how tall we could ever become, right? That's all set by genetics. And you either meet that genetic potential or you don't, right? So he really maintained that, you can't make a horse grow faster than its genetic potential, but you can certainly make a horse grow with poor quality, right? And so that's the really important thing in my mind. It's like, if you're going to have a horse grow quickly, you better have the nutrition. And it's not just, if you're going to feed a lot of calories and make that horse grow fast, you better have the nutrition behind it to back it up. You better have the quality protein. You better have, the copper, the zinc, the vitamin E. You better have all those things in place so that it can grow quality, right? And not just quantity, for want of a better expression, right? So, there's a lot of pieces to it. And of course, as we discussed when we talked about epigenetics, you can also trigger certain genetic switches through nutrition, right? And we still have a lot to learn there for sure. But what was interesting with the OCD, some of the OCD conversations at that conference was that, as I mentioned, OCD can result from a lack of blood flow to the cartilage. So if foals are too heavy at certain points in their life, they're crushing that cartilage and potentially decreasing vascularity. Or again, if you've like pre-programmed the environment to have a decreased vascularity, then they might be at more risk of OCD because they're just not getting the blood flow they need to that. The words elude me. Cartilage. There it is. That cartilage. Words are hard sometimes, right?
They are. It's okay. So we talked about this last time. So some foals are weaned at 4 months, and the sport horse foals, normally it's 5 to 6 months of age. And this is often when the new owner is going to enter the picture, right? So things are starting to change here.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I really personally don't like weaning at 4 months. I think that's too early. I understand it gets done because, as I mentioned, you tend to get that decrease in milk production at 4 months anyway. And so I think there's this sort of thought process that, if the mare can't sustain this foal at that same growth rate anymore, and we need to build her back up because she's pregnant again and we need to have her ready for the next foal, we could do a better job by taking that foal off the mare, right? But, I think it's short-sighted. It's short-sighted. There is so much going on developmentally in these young horses, right? Beyond skeletal health. It's very unnatural for them to be weaned at 4 months. So like horses in their natural setting, they don't get pushed away from the mare until they're much older. I mean, as I mentioned, that foal the weanling I purchased from the sales, it's a little bit like the Mustangs in the US. I don't really want to liken it to that because they're more managed than the Mustangs are. But you have these little herds of horses, and then they're owned by farmers, own them. Right, but they're out wild grazing in the national park. And, farmers will, through herd management, decide we're going to leave that one out. We're going to keep that one in our herd, the way any breeder would, right? I'm going to keep that one as part of my herd. That one I don't want in my herd anymore. I don't need any more colts, right? I've already got a stallion, colts I don't need. And that's what this one was. He was a colt, so he got sold off. But like the fillies might get kept to expand the herd or breed or what have you. And so they just get left on the mares. Nobody's weaning them. They get weaned. They wean naturally, right? And so you'll watch those fillies stay on those mares all the way through the winter. I mean, they don't tend to fall out. Those, because of the environment they're in, they don't tend to fall out until late May, June, early July. And those foals are on that mare all the way through the winter until, really like February, they just sort of end up drifting away, right?
But, I'm just going to play the devil's advocate here for a second.
Uh-huh.
Those are just wild horses living out in the wild. We know that people make money on breeding horses. So we also understand, we understand that it is not ideal for everybody. Not everybody gets to stay that long with their mom.
Absolutely.
I just want to get you off your soapbox about it.
It's this episode's soapbox. No, for sure. That's very true. But I think it's important. I'm a big advocate in understanding, like, if you understand how the natural systems work, if you understand how the digestive system is supposed to work, you can make decisions and choices for how you manage your horse, with that horse's best interest in mind as best you can, right? So keep in mind that they don't get their first molar until they're 9 to 12 months old, right? So their ability to really chew stemmy forage and stuff is somewhat limited until they're 9 to 12 months old. So it would be very unusual for them to be in a natural setting weaned at 4 months. It just wouldn't happen. But yeah, as you say, in a commercial setting or what have you, the reality is that many horses need to be weaned earlier than they otherwise would be. So, 5 to 6 months is very typical in those situations. And obviously weaning's stressful, right? And we want to make it as easy on the foal as possible. A lot of foals actually develop ulcers around weaning because it is stressful. So it's something to keep in mind. In my mind, one of the worst things you can do nutritionally is to wean a foal and then start feeding it things it's never eaten before, right? So again, we're making all these changes. That's what I was just going to ask you. Yeah.
It's like, so if you're buying, you're weaning it, then should I be feeding it the same thing the breeder's feeding it? Is the breeder, I've never bought one. Are they going to know that? Are they going to send the bag of food with them? These are conversations I think you should be having with the breeder,
right? And that there are probably conversations you might want to have even when when you first sign the contract, whenever that is, right? Some people buy foals in utero, right? And then they fall out with the mare and stay with the breeder until they're weaned. Others are just buying weanlings. If if you're buying that foal in utero, you can really probably have a conversation. You're going to have a conversation about the entire process, right? Who's responsible for this? Who's responsible for that? What does that look like? What have you? But if you're just picking up the weanling, you probably don't have much say in how that horse has been managed up to that point. But yes, ideally, find out what that foal's been fed and try to, just as you would for any horse that you buy, right? Ideally, you're going to find out what that horse has been fed and keep feeding that for at least a couple of weeks after you get the horse home, so that that part of its life doesn't change and it can just get used to all the other things first before you make diet changes. And, maybe you can have a conversation with, have some say in what and how that foal gets fed before you buy it. But that's probably going to be, before it comes home with you, that may be unlikely. So yes, trying to maintain what's been done for at least a while would be ideal.
Are there any other considerations when feeding horses at this age?
The big one, I think, is, vitamin E status. I think it's really important to check a foal's vitamin E through blood work. There's a neurologic condition linked to vitamin E deficiency in foals that is irreversible, right? NAD, and we talked about that briefly last time. And so I recommend that all foals have their levels tested before weaning.
So how, this little baby's starting to grow, it's getting older now. How's its nutritional needs going to change over time? So we've brought the baby home at 6 months because you wanted to wait. So 6 months it comes home. Now it's been at home for a while. It's growing. What's changing now? What happens next?
Yeah, so the younger the foal is, right, the faster it's growing. And as it ages, that growth rate slows down. So in growing horses, you have to meet the nutritional needs necessary to maintain the horse at its current weight. But then, which is what we would call its maintenance requirement, right? So let's say the foal weighs 400 pounds. You need to feed it to maintain that 400-pound body weight. But it's also growing, so you also have to feed it extra in order to support the weight, and so that it grows and becomes larger, right? So the amount of nutrients it consumes each day that are needed to maintain itself increase because every day it gets a little bigger, and the amount needed for growth actually goes down because the growth rate slows. Does that make sense? It's like one's going up while one's coming down.
Yeah. So
growth
as they're
rate
growing,
is,
the growth rate slows down. I get it.
Yeah, the growth rate's slowing down over time, but their maintenance requirements going up because they're getting bigger. It takes more to maintain them as they are because they're a bigger animal every day, right? So for some perspective, if we take the protein requirement of a horse that weighs like 500 kilos or 1,100 pounds when it's mature, they will have a protein requirement of 630 grams, right? So your sort of average size, lightweight horse, daily, doing nothing, no work, just mooching about, hanging out in life, 630 grams of protein a day. That same horse, when it was 4 months old, had a protein requirement of 669 grams. So let's sink in for a minute. Okay. So when it weighs 1,000 pounds, 1,100 pounds, it requires 630 grams once it's an adult. When it's 4 months old, it requires 669 grams more protein because it's got so much growth to do. It's growing. It needs so much protein. Right. By 18 months, that requirement is 800 grams. Right. So it's even higher again because it's still growing and it's bigger. It's almost mature size at that point, but it is still growing. Right. So from a calorie perspective, when that horse is mature, it's going to need about 16.5 megacalories per pound just to hang out and be a horse. At 4 months, it needed 13.3, and at 18 months, it required 19.2. So there isn't such a big shift in the calories as there is in the protein, but still, it's a lot of calories. It's 13 calories a day at 4 months and like 16.5 when it's fully grown. I mean, it's pretty mind-blowing, really. Right. So they have big demands when they're little, and those demands decrease over time. Right. So
it's
the
not
need
13
for protein,
calories.
So
You said 13 calories. It's 13
megacalories.
mcals.
13 megacalories. Yes, 13 megacalories. Yeah. So the need
We don't
for
want
protein,
anybody feeding their horse 13 calories.
it'll shrink rapidly.
Yes.
Oh dear. The need for protein is actually far greater than the need for calories, relatively speaking, although they're obviously both high. But by the time that horse gets to about 2 years of age, growth has slowed down enough that they can almost pretty much be fed like a normal balanced diet that maintains good condition. And, you know, if you just keep the condition right, everything will take care of itself as long as the diet's properly balanced.
To make the point again, forage quality is going to be important for these young growing horses.
Yeah, absolutely. And this can be a challenge, right? So, I mean, yeah, we'll say it again for the people at the back, right? Right now, it's definitely like forage quality in this demographic of horses is key. And it's hard, right? Because if you go and buy yourself a weanling or young horse and, you know, your management is to bring it home and put it in a mixed herd situation. And I quite often see that, right? Like people go buy their young horse and they throw it out with their retired, you know, maybe they've got an older horse that has a lameness issue. And so they're retired and, you know, they're just out, you know, and it's great because that old retired horse can teach that young horse so many life lessons, right? That's such an awesome living situation for that young horse to be in. But oftentimes, you know, that group might be being maintained on a low quality round bale, right? And if that's how you're going to manage the forage for that horse, you're looking at needing to feed a lot more calorie dense concentrate to that young horse than if the hay were better quality. But I get it's a challenge when you have a mixed situation, right? And I see a lot of hay bellies on young horses. It's not uncommon. And this can be due to forage quality for sure, poor forage quality. The forage is staying in the digestive tract a long time, sitting there again, depending on their age. They may not have a brilliant hindgut microbial population yet or what have you. So you get these kind of pot-bellied looking young horses. And when you have better quality forage, you know, a lot of times you don't get that. But again, the easier keeping breeds can be maintained really well on, you know, on better quality forage than just a ration balancer. And, you know, but if you're going to feed a lower quality forage, you may need to end up feeding, you know, more concentrate.
And I think it's worth mentioning that hay bellies in young horses can also be due to worms.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's good to bring that up. And our young horse population, they're often host to all sorts of wonderful parasites, especially ascarids. Most of us that have owned mature, you know, older, mature horses may have been lucky enough to never see an ascarid. I remember the first time I saw an ascarid and it scared the bejesus out of me. I was mucking the horse was a long yearling. He was 18 months old and I was mucking his stall out. And I mean, talk about, like, it was a shock. Let me just put it that way. The thing was like over a foot long, this white, it was pretty horrific.
You see them all the time on Horse Vet Corner that somebody's like taking a picture of the manure and they're just like creeping out of it. Oh,
yeah, they're
really quickly.
We really only see them in our young horse population, mainly because our young horses don't yet possess sort of the immunity against, you know, these parasites or what have you. So it really is important if you have a young horse to work with your veterinarian to put a really good deworming program in place. And I think it's important to understand too that some of the sort of like eggs for some of these parasites can stay, I think ascarids is one of them, can stay in the environment for a long time. So yeah, a fun little friend for your little horse.
So to summarize so far what I'm hearing you say, we should try not to wean young horses until they're 5 to 6 months old. They may need to be fed a good quality growth feed starting around 3 or 4 months, and we should continue that after they're weaned. We're going to keep the same food going so we don't upset them or their stomachs.
Yeah, at least through the weaning process, and then you can decide, you know, what you want to do. Yeah.
Yep. And so any of those diet changes need to be made prior to weaning, not after, because it's already going to be a stressful situation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that there's always going to be those situations. Like if you have a horse that gets like fasciitis, like sometimes, for example, like you'll get like, which is an inflammation, often in like the fetlock joints, right? And oftentimes the vet in that scenario will recommend that we need to slow the growth rate down on that foal. So if you've been feeding a concentrate growth feed to that foal they may tell you to stop feeding that feed. Like, don't feed any grain to that foal. And I've certainly had a number of clients in that situation. And, that's going to be the foal that, the temptation is don't feed it any grain, just, leave it on mom and give it hay or what have you. Or sometimes in those situations, you will end up weaning early. I've definitely had clients where the veterinarians wanted their foal taken off the mare at, say, 3 months, because they actually think the mare is producing so much milk. She's so good at lactating that part of the foal's rapid growth is thought to be from the mare. And so they'll wean early to try and slow that growth rate down. I argue in all those cases, we still need quality growth. We still need to make sure all the building blocks are in there, even if we don't need the calories, right? It's the same then at that point. It's like feeding the easy keeper, mature horses. So the ration balancer can really come in then too. So there are going to be times where something happens and you have to make a change. And would you ideally not be changing the diet? Sure. But sometimes stuff happens. It's horses, right? And so you're going to have to make a change.
I knew the answer was going to be ration balancer. Whenever there's a pause or a blank space, just fill it with ration balancer. Ration balancer is always the answer. It is like, we should do another episode on ration balancers. We haven't done that in a while.
We're going to get reputation, but anyway, yeah.
And then the final thing that just to summarize is we need good quality forage. Like, this is the time when you get to go out. No. I'm summarizing where we're at so far. So that was the other one that I wanted to say was the good quality forage. Okay.
For sure.
So once they're weaned, they need to be fed to maintain a steady growth rate and no erratic increases or decreases. Forage quality should be good, and that they should be fed to maintain a good condition. So I think you and I know what that means, right? Because we talk about condition a lot, but I feel like that's kind of something that not everybody understands what that actually means when we say to maintain a good condition. Do you want to just talk about that?
Yeah, right. I mean, I think the easiest thing, perhaps the easiest way, part of it is, look at the horse. Is it pleasant to look at? Like, do you look at it and go, ooh, that's skinny, right? Like, that's probably not a good condition, right? Like, that's a starting, like, what's your gut reaction to seeing a horse? Like, we all have those, right? We all have we've been looking up, we look at horses online all the time, and you just get this gut reaction of like, oof, he's fat, right? Or oof, like, that's really skinny, right? So there's that initial gut reaction, which probably, if you've been around horses for a while, it's valid and means something. Foals are tricky though, because they fluctuate quite a bit, right? And I'm okay with seeing a faint outline of ribs on young horses. Like, I would rather see a slightly lean baby than a fat baby, for the reason I mentioned earlier, right? Like, there's research showing that those heavy babies potentially, those joints are not closed yet, right? Like, their joints are not finished maturing. And if we put a lot of extra weight on those joints, are we setting them up for problems down the road? Quite possibly, right? So I don't like excess weight on young joints. I'm not advocating for thin babies, right? But I'm okay with a faint outline of ribs, right?
Right. Yeah, I agree. And let's be honest, like, young horses fluctuate quite a bit. Like, we've all seen really, really fugly foals. And you're like, that is a foal that only the mother could love, right? They get those like long stringy necks, and they've got maybe the bit of the hay or a worm belly and maybe a little bit of rib. Like, they definitely go through some not lovely stages.
I definitely, and I get my fair share of like, yearling, 18-month-old type, horses that come to me from clients. And, we often get photographs, right, from people. And sometimes they're, butt high, really, like, let's be honest, pretty unattractive. And, and I know from friends that have had young horses, there are times they look at them and go, what did I buy? Like, this is horrific. It better get itself sorted out, because otherwise I've just wasted a lot of money. But they do go through these things. So, yeah, I mean, they really, they're going to grow and maybe look a bit ribby and butt high, and then they're going to gain some weight, and then they're going to go through this phase again. And so it does fluctuate. I just don't want, I don't want fat babies. I don't want fat foals, right? It's just not, And it's tricky, right? Because some folks are breeding for like yearling sales and things. And unfortunately, like we have this idea that they need to look like they're 4 when they're 12 months old, right? And so they're, feeding them up to be like that. But you can, I mean, really, people who do this really well are actually working those young horses. Oh, I'm going to get yelled at now for saying working. I don't mean like, riding them or what have you, but they are going through some kind of, they're turned out, they're living in pasture. If they're not in pasture, hopefully they are in pasture. Babies need to move, don't have them locked in stalls. But like if they're on a limited movement lifestyle, but they are getting some movement, right? Whether that's, I don't know, they just need to move. They need to get, put muscle on, that they look round to the eye because it's muscle, not because it's fat.
Right. Well, I was going to say that about movement. Like, we're talking about nutrition, but part of their growth is them moving around. Like they do need to be able to move. And obviously that's easy to say as somebody that's got a bunch of acreage, right? But I understand, I've lived in the city and I've had horses in the city. Like that's not the reality for a lot of people. So,
it's probably one of my other young horse soapboxes, honestly, is, foals and young horses are not meant to be in box stalls with runs on the back, right? They're not meant to be in 40-foot by 70-foot pens, right? They're meant to be out on acreage and moving, and sporadic arena time is not adequate, right? Like I don't think that some people who buy weanlings and young horses or decide to breed their mare and, keep it at home because they want the joy of seeing that young horse growing up, which I totally get is part of the, reason for doing it, rather than sending it, say, to somebody who foals out and keep that mare in a big pasture setting with other mares and foals. But the data out there really shows the importance of foals being able to sprint, right? Being like bone needs to be loaded. Bone needs to go through stress. Soft tissues need to go through stress while they're growing, right? Terrain is important for hoof development. So being on uneven terrain helps with all that kind of stuff, right? So their skeletons need to undergo dynamic stress. And it's really important for long-term soundness.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is just like, God, I've got all kinds of crazy things to talk about today. I don't know. My brain's really on. But when we were talking about the microbial, like in the stomach.
Yeah. Hindgut.
So if I think about a mare and a foal being in a stall with a run, right? And that foal is eating all kinds of whatever it wants to eat, feces and dirt and anything else. Do you think that the hindgut is going to be healthier if it's turned out in a mixed herd with other horses, other feces? This is just me and my fecal water and like thinking about.
Yeah.
Is there any science on that, or is that just me?
I'm sure there is. I'll have to go ask some of my peer group. I'm sure there is, because people are looking at this kind of thing. There's so much interest in the hindgut microbiome. Yeah.
I just wonder if that like makes a difference as a baby if they're eating other feces and in a mixed herd with other horses, as opposed to just being in either a pen with just their mare or in a stall. Can somebody check into that for me?
Really great question. We will, we should do an episode. We need a microbiome expert. We could save that question for them.
Okay. I'll find one.
Oh, I know you will.
Finally, after a lot of invested time, and let's be honest, like a lot of money, you have a young horse who's ready to start under saddle. And often people send their horses out for training, right, to get broke. How do you support young horses through this process nutritionally?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on the age of the horse, right? So the growth rate is slowing. It's slowed considerably by the time they're 3 or 4, right? Which is when many young, English sport horse type breeds are getting started. And I know all the warm blood folks will be out there saying, but they keep growing till they're 7 or 8. And yes, I get it. They do. But like the majority, at least their height and their long bones in their legs, are done growing at that point. And so the English sport horses tend to get started at 3 or 4. So their growth rate has slowed considerably. the Western disciplines often are starting their horses younger, like 18 months, 2 years old, right? So they're still much more actively growing at that time and also now starting to work. So I think you have to separate these two groups, right? Because if you think about it, the 18-month, 2-year-old is in a very different place growth-wise than the 3-4-year-old, right? So training is going to involve, to your point, like maybe they're going to leave. If you're an owner breeder and you keep your horses until they're full, it may have been only known one property its entire life, right? And it goes out at 3-4 years old to be backed. And that's the first time it's ever left the property. That's a big deal, right? Or maybe you bought it at a weanling and you've kept it at the same boarding facility then for 3 years and send it out. Like that's a big difference, right? So environment can be a big change of routine. Maybe they've been living in, they've been lucky and living in that big, nice group pasture. And now they've gone to the trainers and now they're in a box stall for the first time ever. That's huge. There was some research done actually at Colorado State University. They brought their young horses into their colt starting program, and they've been on pasture and brought into stalls, and they looked at the use of automatic feeders to feed them their concentrate every day versus feeding them twice a day their concentrate. And they looked at the number of ulcers the horses had, and there were definitely ulcers in that equine population, and the horses fed their concentrate multiple times from the slow feeder, automatic feeder, had fewer ulcers the first month than the ones that didn't use a feeder. And then they kind of normalized, I think, at like 60, 90 days. And I would suspect that was probably because at that point they'd adjusted to the routine and they kind of knew what was happening and life was less stressful, right? But yeah, it's a lot of stress. It's a lot of change. They may not be working very hard initially, right? Compared to, say, how they will work later in life. I mean, the 4-year-old dressage horse is not working anywhere close to as hard as a Grand Prix dressage horse, right? So completely different.
Yep.
But it is mentally taxing. And it's the first time that those muscle groups have ever been asked to work in that way, to carry a rider. So it is, hard work in a sense. It's just stress, right? It's a lot of stress. So they're going to have potentially higher caloric needs as a result of that, even if the work isn't particularly physically taxing compared to like the same work on a more mature horse. But it's going to depend on the individual horse, right? Different horses handle those situations differently. Those horses that have started while they're actively growing are going to need more calories, probably from a calorically dense growth or performance feed at that point. Whereas many of the warm blood type horses are just going to do fine with quality hay, and you guessed it, a ration balancer, right? With, additional caloric support as needed.
And then, like we always say, not ration balancer, we say that all the time too, but follow the feeding instructions.
Oh, we say that
the bag.
too.
Read the bag and follow the directions on the back of the bag for whatever feed you choose. That's really important.
And this is definitely a group where you could get yourself into a bit of trouble with that, right? So they may need more than a ration balancer, but not the full serving of performance feed, and they end up getting fed a performance feed incorrectly. Right? When in fact, maybe some of both is actually the answer, because just feeding a pound and a half of ration balancer isn't going to maintain their condition, but 6, 8, 9 pounds of performance feed is too much. And so what happens is people then fall into the trap of, well, I'll feed 3 pounds of performance feed and then they're nutrient deficient, right? So and again, they're still growing. They still need all those nutrients and things that are in there. So one of my biggest concerns during this transition to kind of training and being started is gut health, as I mentioned, because of that stress. And it can really do a number on the gut, everything from gastric ulcers, as I mentioned, but also hindgut disruption. So I strongly recommend using UlcerGuard for the first couple of weeks that they're in that training program to help ease the transition to a new facility or routine. I also look at feed ingredients, and I try to pick feeds that have good levels of digestive support. And I look for ingredients like butyric acid that helps maintain the gut lining. I'm looking for postbiotics that help stabilize the hindgut. Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast cultures, Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast extract. If I'm looking for live probiotic type ingredients, we're looking for tens of billions of CFUs per pound in that feed, not millions. And, things like Bacillus subtilis, that's a probiotic, spore-forming probiotic that helps remove pathogens from the gut that might otherwise lead to inflammation in the gut lining. And, these feeds with those kinds of ingredients, they're going to cost you more, right? These are not cheap ingredients necessarily, but in my mind, this is not the time to be trying to cut costs, right? Like you're really, you're going to save yourself money in the long run by helping this horse through this stressful situation. And, in some cases, it could negatively impact the horse for a very long time, right? If their gut health goes awry at this point in their life, the ramifications and that can have a long lasting effect, not just in the gut, but systemically.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com.
We know that if you're like us, you're probably listening to this while driving or doing barn chores. But when your hands are free, if you'd share it with your friends on social media and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, it helps other horse lovers like you to find us.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.